what I drew attention to were 7 conditions that I thought were converging to create a devil's brew for racial and ethnic unrest. And I'm going to read to you at times from the book, and also the conditions that I felt back in 2002 were creating a devil's brew for racial unrest. And any of these things individually might not amount to much, but then when you put them together, converging, then you get this devil's brew. And one of the conditions was the concerns that Americans had about immigration, legal and illegal, and how immigration was changing the demographics of the nation. And back then, the estimates were, or the projections were, that by 2050, the country would be majority minority. That's going to happen before 2050. It may happen before 2045, but it's going to happen before 2050. And by 2020, a majority of the children in public schools will be a racial or ethnic minority. And then the white population itself is aging. And so one of the first issues I identified was the immigration, the demographic changes that were reshaping America. And back then, there were some cities and states that were becoming majority minority, and now they've already become majority minority. And even as that trend continues, it's likely that minorities will be concentrated in maybe 8 or 9 states, and then the rest of the states will be majority white. And that has to do with just how people live. And during the time that I was looking at, doing this research, there was a demographer at the University of Michigan named William Frey, and he and this journalist named Jonathan Talov had pointed out that people were naturally resegregating based on race, and that the Americans were redistributing themselves. And so people that used to flee racial and ethnic minorities by moving to the suburbs, they were moving to Iowa. They were moving to states that were majority white. They were moving to they're moving cross country. And then the racial and ethnic minorities, like Asians, were, moving to California. Jews were moving, where their group had a majority. Blacks were returning to the South. And so we were just naturally resegregating ourselves. And that was a trend that they thought was worth reporting, because it was a different kind of choice that people were making at the time. People were not choosing to live among people of other races and ethnicities, and everyone was doing it. And so, the whole story about racism and all of this, it's not just a white story. It's a story maybe about human nature. Maybe it's something about us that's tribal, but that was taking place. There were structural changes in the global economy that was causing the loss of high-wage production jobs. And so you had a lot of people that had low levels of education, whites, blacks, everyone, that were working those jobs, they were losing jobs. And anyone here from North Carolina? Okay. Well, North Carolina is a state where they had a lot of textile plants and various kinds of plants. In Virginia had Mohawk rubber. They had all these places where people could get a job, they could raise a family, they could stay there. Well, those jobs, especially after NAFTA, those jobs were gone. And so people were concerned about that. There was the white resentment and hostility over affirmative action. And part of what I didn't tell you is that before I had my conversion experience, I was writing a book on affirmative action, and it was called When Whites and Blacks Agree. And the story that I was telling in my book was that if you gave people concrete situations, vignettes, whites and blacks would always agree on what was fair, even if it applied to someone of a different race. And I had survey data where you randomly randomize the race or the gender or the social class of the person in the vignette, and whites and blacks would always pick the same person, usually the underdog, which meant sometimes a majority of blacks would choose the white underdog and a majority of whites would choose the black underdog. And so I had this positive story that I thought I would be telling about race relations. But then some things started happening in the late 1990s that made that story less important, and some of it had to do with high-profile crimes that involved interracial violence. And so it's a long story how that research got folded into this book on white nationalism. But the affirmative action, always been a grievance, and has not been as accepted among blacks as you might think. And it's never worked the way many people thought it worked. Like I've seen it up close, and it doesn't work the way people think it works. There was concern about high black on white crime. So I've given you immigration, structural changes in the global economy affecting high-wage production jobs, white resentment and hostility over affirmative action, concerns about high black on white violent crime rates, the growing push and acceptance of multiculturalism and identity politics. And you might ask, well, how does that fit in? It fit in because on the college campuses, there was so much focus on the ethnic studies and the multiculturalism and, the ethnic pride that was, I say in the book, and I'll read to you parts of the book, how that was fueling white identity. And white people were the young people were starting to think in terms of, okay, if everyone else can celebrate, their unique background and their heritage, then what about us? And so everyone wanted a hyphenated identity. And so, you could be African American or you could be Latino. Well, there were some whites that wanted to be European Americans or whatever. They wanted the hyphenated identities too. That was taking place. And I saw that the language of multiculturalism and identity politics was providing the justification for white identity and white interests. And I say in this book that would be the next stage of identity politics in America, because there were people that were very upset about racial double standards. And that was like a grievance. And the people that I call the new white nationalists, they call themselves now the alt-right, but they didn't just happen. They may call themselves the alt-right. They have rebranded themselves, but these were people who were well educated. Many of them have college degrees, Ivy League degrees, and they were using that language to make a case for white people to organize for white self-interest. And so that's why I call them the new white nationalists, because they were using ideas, social science data, FBI statistics, science. They were making an intellectual case for white people to do as racial and ethnic minorities had done.